Well, I think the first thing was the excitement of the secret that my mother told us, that Daddy had been chosen to appear on this show. Really because he brought Eamonn Andrews over from Ireland and gave him his start. And secondly, it was an enormous show on television. Everybody watched it. And we couldn't wait to see what was going to happen. We had no idea what was going to happen. And I remember being very anxious about his reaction. My mother Mildred was beautiful and glamorous and did everything for and with my father. So she knew everything about his work, she was deeply involved in it, she typed out his programme, she worked in the office every day. So unlike some of the wives, she was very much involved in his career. She told us quite late. I think it was about 2 weeks before it was going to happen. She didn't actually mention it to my brother because she was frightened he might say something to his friends. But he was very excited and he got a new suit and he knew that he was going out for the event. And I didn't even tell my best girlfriend. It was lovely having family there. I remember my father's brother and sister and so on. I remember being really impressed to meet Anthony Hurley and Faye Saxton. And I'd watched them on Come Dancing Strictly, which is such a huge programme, started with the Come Dancing programmes, which my father played for many, many, many years and won all those Carl Allen awards. One of the other guests was a man called Joe Brannelly. Now, Joe Brannelly was really like a close uncle. And during the war, we shared a house in Farnham Common with Joe, Uncle Joe, Auntie Betty and their daughter Carol. And we had such fun, and he was in music publishing. I remember being surrounded by the world of music in those days. Oh, he was utterly surprised. I actually tried to get out of him afterwards whether he had any idea of whether this was going to happen, but he had none whatsoever. And I think he was very honoured. Remember, my pa was an East End boy. His father was an immigrant. His brother and two sisters were born in Russia. They came from Minsk. And he had made good. And when he first had his first small band in Tottenham Court Road, he used to walk to work from the East End, from Spitalfields, because he didn't have the money and a cloak and a high hat. He never quite got over the fact that he had this fame because he was very much a man of the people. Most of his work was playing around the country. He wasn't just a London band, whilst he did pay, and he was very honoured for the royal family, for Princess Margaret's wedding, Princess Anne's, all the royal parties at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. He actually loved his life around the country, and he played for all the working men's clubs in those days. They used to close, the factories closed for holidays for 2 weeks and everybody went to Blackpool or wherever for their holidays. I remember going to visit Eamonn and Grona, his late wife. She died after him. I remember when their first child was growing up, Emma, I think her name is, and we used to go to their house at the back of Chiswick, and it was just like going to family. My father wasn't at all pretentious, Eamonn wasn't at all pretentious, but I actually didn't know very much other than the fact that they were both very professional men and they didn't mix their home lives with show business. I think that they both worked all the time. You have to remember that my father worked, I think in 1959, he stopped touring and started playing at the Hammersmith Palais. And I think that finished in 1972, from memory. I actually got engaged to my late husband, who lived in Chiswick at that time, so it was my fun to drive my father. But my dad didn't really have a social life in that sense. He had a family life and a working life. But I'm sure their paths crossed. But I suspect Eamonn's life was probably very similar. On the second programme, it was a sparkling evening. Again, he had absolutely no idea. And I asked Mummy whether he really didn't have any idea, and he really didn't. He was just very excited about the anniversary. And by that time, I had my 4 children, although none of the children knew what was happening. I can't remember. Maybe Paul, my oldest son, had been told and was going to keep the secret. I think maybe the two oldest boys, Paul and Andrew. And I remember a scene where Danny and Mark were put in front of the band, and the baton was put in her hand, but the children were really excited. I remember seeing the smiling face of my very creative late husband, Robert. He was so proud of the family, of this honour, of his children being on the show, and he adored my parents. So that's one of my memories. Another one is the late and incredible Joyce Blair and Lionel, because Lionel was a great friend of Daddy's. He used to treat Daddy as if he was a kind of surrogate father, I think, and a fantastic dancer. And he'd been involved in the launch of March of the Mods and the Madison and all those dances. And that was the next generation on from the Hurleys in the earlier programme. It's interesting where that link lies. One of the most exciting things about the second programme, Daddy had a singer called Ross McManus who was with him for over 15 years. And Ross had a son called Declan, and Declan turned out to be Elvis Costello. And Elvis's music, which is quite incredible to this very day, was very influential in those times, the sort of 70s and the 80s onwards. And I was so excited to be on the programme with them. I'd grown up as a little girl with Ross in the Isle of Man, and we used to go off fishing and doing all sorts of other things. And he was so proud of this very famous son of his. So yes, and Elvis to this day speaks about my father whenever he does a concert and a programme. He's absolutely sure that Daddy was a big influence on the development of his musical career. There was a huge audience that night. I can't even remember all the names. Bernard Braden, for example, Alan Wicker, who was always on television. One of the people that is very close to my heart to this day is Vera Lynn. Vera's voice was so beautiful. She has a purity, and she's always been part of our life. Now, she's another totally wonderful lady with humility. She's never been arrogant. She always says she came from a working background like my father's, has no pretensions, and yet was such a big influence to people listening to her during the war and afterwards. I think he was really shocked, and we can see his face because we've got the video. The expression on my father's face was such a lovely one, and the way that he and Eamonn looked at each other was of utter friendship. I hadn't realised that until I re-looked at the video. He didn't expect it because he was such a stickler and such a perfectionist for all his performances. He never performed without absolute preparation, months ahead, about every single detail of the evening. Things didn't happen by accident. You don't just walk onto the bandstand. And everybody knew him as the ultimate professional. I think he was really surprised, and then he was terribly proud. We were very, very well aware that it was the second occasion, that it was still an incredible show, an incredible honour. He never quite accepted in his head that this wasn't a dream. And he always said to everybody, I even get paid for doing my favourite thing in the whole world. When he was buried, Spike Milligan, walking back from the grave with these many, many hundreds of people that surrounded him, said to me, I put a rose on your father's grave. It's not the tradition in this country to put flowers on a Jewish grave, but I'm telling you that your father was the nicest man in show business that I've ever met.